Joining me in the studio is the historian and science writer Andrea Wolff and the historian of wood, energy use and environmental thought at the University of Cambridge, Dr. Paul Ward. We start with a man who
was one of those wonders of the world, like Aristotle, like Julius Caesar, who appear from time to time as if to show us the possibilities of the human mind, the force and the range of the faculties, a universal man.
That was Ralph Waldo Emerson speaking in Boston at the centennial celebrations held in September 1869 for Alexander von Humboldt. Since then, in the English-speaking world at any rate, Humboldt's star has somewhat faded. But in Germany, as the number of universities and museums named after him testify, he remains a titanic figure. Perhaps it takes a German, then, to make the case for him not just as a man of his time, but as the father of what today we call environmental science. Andrea Wolff is the author of a forthcoming book, The Invention of Nature, The Adventures of Alexander von Humboldt, the Lost Hero of Science. And Andrea, before we come on to The Invention of Nature, could I just ask you about this lost hero of science? In what way was Humboldt a hero? Give us a brief biographical sketch.
So Humboldt was born in 1769, and he was a German scientist, but he was also a daring explorer. He went on a 5-year exploration of Latin America, paddling down the Orinoco, crossing the Andes. He, even as a 60-year-old, crossed Russia all the way to the Altai Mountains, 10,000 miles.
And you followed in his footsteps some of the way?
I did, in Latin America rather than in Russia. So I went down the Orinoco, and then I went up the Chimborazo, which is today in Ecuador, but was then believed to be the highest mountain in the world.
And he was going there not just as an explorer, but as a scientist.
And that's what I find so extraordinary about him. He takes, for example, 42 instruments all wrapped in kind of like velvet-lined boxes and schleps them up the Chimborazo almost to 20,000 feet. But he also, every few hundred yards, kind of, takes out the instruments, sets them up, measures gravity, the boiling point of water, the blueness of the sky. He's this man who is incredibly adventurous and also obsessed with measurements. He is the last of the Polymath, and he tries to understand nature as this kind of like interconnected whole. And he has this moment on the Chimborazo where he looks down and he sees kind of the mountain ranges kind of folded beneath him when everything comes together. So that's why I wanted to follow his footsteps.
So the way you describe him, he sounds a bit like a kind of one-man Wikipedia.
He had this extraordinary memory where he could recognize stuff he had seen across distances and across decades. So, for example, when he's in Latin America, when he's on the Chimborazo, he realizes that he's seeing the same plants that he's seen before in the Pyrenees or in the Alps. So he makes these connections across continents. But he also dies at a time, which is really the very last moment where one man or one woman can hold all knowledge in their head, because after that, scientists start to crawl into their kind of narrow disciplines.
And when does he die?
He dies in 1859, same year as Darwin publishes The Origin of Species.
And the fact that he is able to, in a way, synthesize the entirety of human knowledge in this way, does that influence his scientific understanding of how the world functions?
Absolutely. So he does something very different to other scientists at that time. So scientists at that time are very much interested in classification, for example. So a botanist, for example, will collect plants and then think about taxonomic units. Humboldt thinks about plants in terms of their climate and location. So he really comes up with this idea of global climate and vegetation zones, which doesn't sound very exciting today. But if you think about it, that's really the beginning of seeing the Earth as one living organism where everything hangs together.
So that's very much associated with what's been called the Gaia hypothesis, James Lovelock's theory that the world functions kind of as an organism. Is there a sense in which Humboldt is a foreshadower of that?
Absolutely. He writes a book called Cosmos, which is a huge international bestseller. And he originally thought of calling it Gaia.
And Paul, as a historian of science yourself, do you recognise this portrait of Humboldt as the precursor of modern environmentalism?
Well, yes, I do. But I think Humboldt was at the same time a man of his times, and what in a sense was testimony to his extraordinary ability as a polymath was that the kind of education that he would have had was extremely polymathic, and it was expected of any forester or someone, even someone managing a farm, should be able to master an extraordinary knowledge of maths and chemistry and natural history, know something about the atmosphere and their interaction. But the practical fact was that most people couldn't do this, but Humboldt could, and that's really where he stands apart, in the sense he lived up to the greatest expectations of his generation.
What is so extraordinary about Humboldt is that he is really not very much interested in books so much. So there's a wonderful story where his brother is very much into kind of Greek mythology, and then there's Humboldt, and Humboldt always escapes from the classroom. He's always going out into the forest. He's roaming through nature, and that really inspires him.
So not a great book reader, but André, your book, The Invention of Nature, will be published in the autumn.